I never thought a single job interview could end with me questioning my own sanity, but there I was, standing in a basement that smelled like old copper and formaldehyde, looking at a contract that essentially asked me to sign my soul away for a paycheck that seemed too good to be true. They told me I'd be a specialized caretaker, but they didn't tell me that the patient wasn't exactly human anymore, or that I'd have to listen to the scratching sounds coming from inside the walls every time the sun went down. My hands were shaking as I held the pen, knowing that if I walked away, I'd be homeless by the end of the week, but if I stayed, I might not make it out of that house with my mind intact. Was I wrong for taking the money even after I saw the first warning sign written in blood on the back of the pantry door? Or would you have done the exact same thing if you were staring down a mountain of debt with no other way out? I need you to listen to what happened during my 3 months in that house because everyone I know thinks I've lost it, but I know what I saw, and I know why that job is considered the worst in the entire world. To understand how I ended up in that nightmare, you have to understand how desperate I was. My name is Sarah, and 6 months ago, my life was a complete wreck. I had lost my administrative job at a law firm after the company downsized. My car had been repossessed, and I was 3 months behind on rent for a studio apartment that was already falling apart. I was scouring every job board, every Craigslist ad, and every shady help-wanted sign I could find. That's when I saw the posting. It was simple, almost too simple. It read, high-paying position for a discreet, resilient individual. Live-in caretaking for a private estate. No experience necessary, but must be able to follow strict instructions without question. Salary, $15,000 per month. I thought it was a typo. He pointed to a small, reinforced steel door at the end of the hallway. That is your only priority, he said. Every 4 hours, you place a bowl of raw meat and a glass of salt water in the slot. You do not look through the slot. You do not talk to whatever is inside. And most importantly, if you hear it calling your name in your mother's voice, you put on these noise-canceling headphones and do not take them off until the sun rises. I thought it was some kind of elaborate prank or a psychological experiment. I asked him what was behind the door, and he just looked at me with those dead eyes and said, a consequence of a curiosity that went too far. Just do the job, Sarah, and the money will be in your account every Friday. The first week was actually easy. I'd deliver the meat, hear some heavy breathing from behind the steel, and then go back to my room to watch movies. I spent my days exploring the upper floors, though most of the doors were locked tight. I found old journals from people who lived there in the 1800s, writing about a mirror of truth that the family patriarch had brought back from an expedition in the deep desert. They wrote about how he stopped eating, stopped sleeping, and just stared into the glass until his skin turned the color of ash. I shrugged it off as gothic fiction until the sounds started changing. It wasn't just breathing anymore. It was a rhythmic tapping, like someone was trying to Morse code their way through the metal. Then came the whispers. At first, it was just unintelligible muttering, but by the 10th day, it started saying my name. Sarah. Sarah, help me. It's so cold in here. It sounded exactly like my mom, who had passed away 3 years ago. I felt my heart drop into my stomach. I knew it wasn't her. I knew it was impossible, but the grief and the isolation of that house started playing tricks on me. I'd stay up late at night, sitting on the cold basement floor, just inches away from that steel door. I'd tell myself I was just doing it to make sure the patient was okay, but in reality, I was desperate for a connection to the woman I missed so much. I started documenting everything in a small notebook I found in the library. I noted that the scratching always started exactly 7 minutes after the sun dipped below the horizon, and it always ended the moment the first bird chirped at dawn. The whispers grew more specific, mentioning childhood memories, the way my mom used to burn the toast on Sunday mornings, the specific lullaby she sang when I had a fever, even the secret name I had for my stuffed rabbit when I was 5. How could a monster know those things? I began to wonder if the patient was some kind of telepathic entity or a ghost trapped in the physical world. I started noticing other things around the house too. Photographs where the people's faces would seem to shift into expressions of pure agony when I wasn't looking directly at them. Mirrors that stayed foggy even when the room was bone dry, with tiny handprints appearing on the glass from the inside. One afternoon, I found a loose floorboard in my bedroom. Underneath was a collection of ID cards, 6 of them, all women in their mid-20s, all with the same look of desperate hope I had when I first arrived. I searched their names on my phone, but there were no records of them anywhere online. It was like they had been erased from existence. I started to realize that the discretion mentioned in the job ad wasn't for the employer's privacy. It was for the employee's disappearance. By the second month, I was a nervous wreck. I hadn't seen Mr. Thorne since the first night. He just left notes and bags of raw meat in a refrigerated locker by the back door, along with my weekly pay stub confirming the $15,000 had been deposited. I was rich, but I was falling apart. I stopped eating anything other than canned soup. I stopped sleeping more than 2 hours at a time. The house felt alive, like the walls were breathing in sync with my own lungs. Every shadow seemed to have a weight to it, and I could feel eyes on the back of my neck even when I was alone in my room. The air grew colder every day, regardless of the thermostat. I started wearing 3 layers of sweaters, but the chill felt like it was coming from inside my bones. I began to talk to the door. "Who are you?" I'd ask, my voice trembling. The response was always the same. My mother's voice, crying, begging for a glass of water, telling me she was so thirsty. The salt water I was instructed to give it felt like a cruel joke, yet I followed the orders because I was terrified of what would happen if I didn't. I began to have vivid hallucinations of the house expanding, of hallways that stretched into infinity, and of Thorne watching me from the shadows with a stopwatch in his hand. One night, the power went out during a massive thunderstorm. The monitors went dark, and the basement was plunged into a blackness so thick it felt like I was drowning. I grabbed my flashlight, but when I turned it on, the beam was incredibly weak, struggling to pierce the gloom. I made my way to the steel door to deliver the midnight meal, but when I got there, the door wasn't just closed. It was vibrating. Something on the other side was throwing itself against the metal with such force that the hinges were groaning. Then the voice changed. It wasn't my mom anymore. It was my own voice. It was me, screaming from the other side of the door, begging for myself to open it. "Please, Sarah, they're hurting me. Open the door. They're coming for me, Sarah, please." I was standing there, listening to myself scream in absolute terror, and I realized I was losing my grip on reality. I had the key in my hand. I wanted to see. I needed to know if I was losing my mind or if there was truly another version of me locked in that dark hole, suffering while I sat in luxury upstairs. The air in the basement turned freezing, and I could see my own breath in the flashlight beam. The scratching moved from the door to the walls around me, 1,000 tiny claws digging into the stone. I felt like the house was closing in, demanding that I make a choice. I felt like the shadows were hands reaching for my ankles, pulling me toward the steel door. Every instinct told me to run, but my feet were frozen to the floor. The voice on the other side started reciting my bank account balance, then my social security number, then the exact date and time of my death. It was a sensory overload of horror and confusion. So that's the situation I was in. Trapped in a decaying mansion with something that could mimic my dead mother and my own terrified voice, holding the key to a door I was warned never to open. I had already made $75,000 in those 2 months, enough to change my life forever, but I was seconds away from throwing it all away just to satisfy a morbid curiosity. Before I tell you what I saw when I finally turned that key, I want you to pause and comment below what you would have done in my shoes. Would you have kept the door locked and taken the money? Or would the psychological torture have broken you too? Tell me the truth, because what comes next is something I can never unsee. I couldn't help it. The screaming, my own screaming, became too much. I shoved the key into the lock and turned it. The heavy iron bolt slid back with a deafening crack that echoed through the entire house. I pulled the door open just a crack, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The room inside wasn't a room at all. It was a cavernous space that seemed to defy the dimensions of the house, stretching back for what looked like miles into a gray, featureless mist. And in the center of it, there was no monster. There was no other me. There was just a massive floor-to-ceiling mirror framed in human bone, pulsing with a faint, sickly green light. But the reflection wasn't the room I was standing in. The reflection showed a beautiful, sunlit garden where my mother was sitting on a bench, looking younger and healthier than I'd ever seen her. She was wearing her favorite blue dress, the one she was buried in, and she looked up and smiled at me, beckoning me to come inside. "Come home, Sarah," she whispered, her voice no longer coming from behind the door but from inside my own head. She looked so real, so warm. I reached out a hand, my fingers inches from the glass. But as I stepped closer, the edges of the mirror began to bleed. The garden started to rot in real time. The flowers turning into black sludge, the sun turning into a weeping eye of fire. My mother's face began to melt away like wax, her eyes widening into bottomless pits, revealing a hollow gray void. I realized then that the job wasn't to feed a monster. The meat was an offering to the mirror to keep whatever was on the other side satisfied, so it wouldn't seek fresh souls. By opening the door, I had broken the seal. I had invited the void out. Suddenly, a hand, long gray, and with too many joints, reached out from the glass and grabbed my wrist. The coldness that radiated from it was like nothing I'd ever felt. It felt like my very blood was freezing in my veins, turning to ice. I screamed and tried to pull away, but it was too strong. It started pulling me toward the glass, and I could see my own reflection in the rot. Except my reflection was laughing a silent, manic laugh. I saw other faces in the glass too. Previous caretakers, their eyes sewn shut with silver thread, reaching out to pull me into their eternal misery. I saw the girls from the ID cards, their bodies twisted and fused into the frame of the mirror. Their mouths open in a silent, everlasting scream. They weren't dead. They were part of the furniture of this hellish dimension. Just as my face was inches from the mirror, just as I felt the cold glass begin to yield like liquid against my skin, the basement lights flickered back on. Mr. Thorne appeared out of nowhere, holding a heavy iron shroud. He threw it over the mirror with a practiced motion, and the grip on my wrist instantly vanished. I fell back onto the cold concrete, gasping for air, my wrist bruised and blackened where the thing had touched me. The marks looked like fingerprints burned into my flesh. Thorne didn't help me up. He didn't even look concerned. He just looked at the open door and sighed with a profound, weary disappointment, as if I were just the latest in a long line of failures. "You were the longest-lasting one, Sarah," he whispered, his voice sounding older than the house itself. "But curiosity is a debt that always collects. You've seen the garden now. You'll never be able to unsee it. You've let the hunger breathe, and now it knows your scent." He told me I had to leave immediately. No more money, no more house, no second chances. He escorted me to the edge of the property in total silence, the moonlight casting long, jagged shadows across the gravel. As I walked down that driveway for the last time, I looked back at the mansion. In every single window, on every single floor, I could see a figure standing there. They all looked like me. They were wearing my clothes, they had my hair, and they were all pressing their hands against the glass, watching me walk away with expressions of pure, unadulterated envy. I realized then that the previous employees hadn't just quit. They had been pulled in, replaced by reflections that now lived in that half-light world behind the glass. I spent the next few weeks in a daze, hiding in a cheap motel. The money I had earned was still in my account, all 75,000 of it, which was the only thing that kept me from thinking the whole thing was a hallucination. I used it to move across the country, to a bright, modern city where there are no Victorian mansions and no woods for miles. I live in a penthouse now, with floor-to-ceiling windows, trying to drown out the memory of that basement. But the money doesn't bring peace. I spent thousands on security systems, on therapists, on experimental treatments for the nerve damage on my wrist that no doctor can explain. I live in a world of glass and steel, yet I feel more vulnerable than ever. I can't look at mirrors for too long. If I stare at my own eyes for more than a few seconds, I see the garden starting to bloom in the background. I see the black sludge dripping from the edges of my own pupils. Sometimes, when the room is quiet, I hear a faint tapping coming from the other side of my bathroom mirror. A rhythmic, desperate knocking. It's not just tapping anymore. It's the sound of someone scraping a knife against the glass. And every time I pass my reflection in a shop window, I swear I see my mother standing just behind my shoulder, her hand reaching out to touch my hair, only to vanish when I turn around. I see the other versions of myself in the reflections of puddles, in the screens of my phone, in the glass of my oven. They are all waiting. I've started covering the mirrors in my home with black cloth, just like Mr. Thorne did with the iron shroud. My friends think I'm having a breakdown. They tell me I'm lucky to have so much money and that I should be enjoying life. They don't understand that every time I close my eyes, I'm back in that basement. I'm back in front of the door. I tried to tell a therapist about it, but she just suggested I had PTSD from the stress of my job loss and the isolation of the woods. She doesn't understand that the blackened fingerprints on my wrist haven't faded. They've started to spread, crawling up my arm like a slow-moving vine of frost. She doesn't understand that I'm still being watched. The patient wasn't behind the door. The patient was the world itself, and the door was the only thing keeping the infection at bay. I found a note in my pocket yesterday. It wasn't there before. It was in Mr. Thorne's handwriting. It said, "The mirror is hungry again, Sarah. It remembers the taste of your fear." I haven't slept since I found it. I've started seeing Thorne in the crowd when I go out for groceries. He just stands there, checking his stopwatch, waiting for the inevitable. I realize now that the $75,000 wasn't a salary. It was a down payment on my soul. I'm just a placeholder until the mirror decides it's time for me to come home to the garden. That job was the worst in the world, not because of the labor, but because it showed me that some doors are meant to stay locked for a reason. I survived, but I didn't come back whole. I left a part of myself in that basement, and I think the thing in the mirror is still wearing my face, waiting for its turn to walk in the sun, waiting for the moment I finally break and look into the glass one last time. I have the money now, but I'd give every cent of it back if it meant I could sleep through the night without hearing my own voice screaming from the basement of my memory. I'd give it all back to be poor and safe again. I learned the hard way that when something sounds too good to be true, the price you pay isn't always in dollars, it's in pieces of your soul. Like this video if you were on my side and think I was just a victim of impossible circumstances. Or tell me in the comments if you think I was greedy and got exactly what I deserved for ignoring the warnings. Subscribe for more stories like this because believe me, there are darker things in this world than a mountain of debt. Share your final thoughts on this whole mess in the comments section, and let me know if you've ever taken a job that felt a little too off. I'll be reading the comments, looking for anyone else who might have seen that house in the woods, or met a man named Mr. Thorne. I'll see you all in the next story.